Stephen Rainey from ATP Ethics Management, also from the Montfort University. He has a master's degree and a PhD within the field of philosophy. He has published articles on topics related to philosophy of language, group identity, ethics, governance, and ICT's understanding and rationality. He works within the field of philosophical treatments of ethics, ICTs, governance and policy, European identity, and the role of citizenry in governance in knowledge societies. His present interests include philosophy of technology, artificial intelligence, and identity, and the challenges of policy making. And then he acts as a consultant to the ethics sector of the European Commission. And then currently he is also a HEP fellow and has a key role in writing this informed consent standard operating procedure. And I hope you'll tell more about this one, and I'll try to make you a presenter.
First of all, apologies for coming late to the party. My laptop decided this morning was the time to die on me, so I'm on a reserve laptop today. Some of the stuff that I was going to say has been touched on already, and so I'll just be talking about it in this with the specifics of the SOP that we're currently trying to write. I'm just sharing the screen now, with the SOP itself. Hopefully that's visible to everyone.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So among the challenges that have already been mentioned are the multiple sorts of types of data that we have to deal with in the Human Brain Project. So we've heard about clinical data, personal, sensitive data as well. So from, for instance, patients in persistent vegetative states, some longitudinal data, alongside what was just described as sort of pure research data, and also secondary use of data. So we have these are among the sorts of data things that we have to deal with. We also have multiple institutions, so we got things like hospitals and research centres and universities that working in their own particular ways on these sorts of data, as well as multiple jurisdictions. So despite having directives, as we all know, the different European directives are interpreted in different ways in different European countries. Besides that as well, we have some data from outside of the European Union. So we have all these different types of data, we have different institutional treatments of data, we have different jurisdictions of data. Among all of these sorts of challenges, we're supposed to come up with, structurally speaking, we're supposed to come up with information sheets and consent forms. So these are what's expected from us, from the European Commission, such that we can have a very clear record of information sheets that are provided to volunteers and other participants, alongside signed consent sheets. The idea of this is that these are then the documents for the consent, and these are what we rely on to demonstrate that we have been very thoughtful and coherent in our approach toward this. It should be fairly obvious that a single sort of template isn't possible for our project. As Bernd described it, we've got hundreds of participants on all these different activities. This means that we have to come up with some other form of complying with the European Commission's expectations, particularly the reviewers' expectations, which can be dynamic in the sense that we undergo multiple reviews, sometimes multiple reviews at the same time. And we have different suggestions from different reviewers. So we have a lot to keep up with in that respect. And again, all this happens in the broader context of the GDPR coming in, the General Data Protection Regulation in May 2018. This was just mentioned as well. So there's a very dynamic context going on and a lot of high stakes because, as we know, informed consent is vital. It's in the Lisbon Treaty and at least. So you can see in the SOP here, this is the introduction where it mentions just what I've said and goes through some of the expectations on us. Then we have some discussion about the background to this, about directives and the reasons why this comes about. We have a list of stakeholders which is mainly drawn from the Horizon 2020 rules, which I suppose are another set of criteria I should have mentioned as constraining our activities alongside all of the other material. So we have in Horizon 2020, all researchers have to give themselves a self-assessment form which highlights their ethics issues. And in that, we have a list of stakeholders which we have managed to extract here to show the people that are relevant to informed consent in terms of the Human Brain Project. So, I mean, this is an illustration of the way in which we try to cope with all the different constraints upon us and all the different challenges, and it's by trying to become quite not abstract in the sense of non-applied, but abstract in the sense of abstracting from all of the different criteria, the fundamental criteria that we have. So we can see that this is one element of that. And the implementation of this comes about through, again, Horizon 2020, where we try to take the standards that they have and we try to use the responses that the Human Brain Project researchers have given us to find out what are the issues that are going on within the project, and then we try to make an approach toward those which is consistent with the standards. So we have our challenges as listed, and we have the forms, the abstract criteria from the different standards. We try to then give a minimal set of criteria from which it's hoped that the researchers themselves can then analyze their own tasks and then see which parts of the backdrop are relevant to them. So we have here the information sheet minimal criteria. So whenever someone is researching, say, on human participants, healthy volunteers within a hospital context, they should be able to look at this table, which I'll just scroll through slowly, and they should be able to see the bits that are relevant for them. This then gives them the criteria that allow them to write their information sheet such that it should cover everything that from Horizon 2020 and beyond. This table itself, again, is abstracted a little from the Horizon 2020 criteria, but also it's built upon. And we've added more based on our ethics reviewer comments, and also our broader reading. So we try to keep this up to date with current research as well. So you can see that goes on for a little while. Some of the research activities are quite difficult to include. So we have everything from the clinical setting to survey data. And in a form like this, then that can be quite off-putting to the person who's just doing surveys because this is quite big. But it seems like a good way forward. There remain lots of specific challenges despite our best efforts here. So for instance, we have incidental findings. This is very difficult to deal with, particularly because of the jurisdiction questions. So for instance, apparently in German legislation, should someone not agree to be informed about incidental findings, then they should be excluded from studies. So there's not really a choice in that. Whereas in other European nations, that isn't going to be the same. If you don't want to know about your incidental findings, you can simply tick the box that says "Don't tell me." So we can't make a policy, a HBB policy exactly on incidental findings. So again, we're in a position where we need to have quite a complicated response to that. And that's sort of that challenge comes from within the informed consent as a very idea. But then we have broader problems as well. There are no problems, there are only challenges. Sorry, we have broader challenges. So for instance, I heard about the withdrawal of data earlier. This is a very, very tricky concept for HPV to deal with because we're using lots of federated data, there's lots of secondary use of data, lots of data sets being combined in different ways, sometimes using algorithmic processes, which make it really quite challenging to imagine that one could ever remove someone's data from that. That gives a challenge directly to the right to be forgotten, which will come in the GDPR. There's also the concept of broad consent that was mentioned earlier. This is sort of something that comes from, if we were to use sources from biobanks, we assume broad consent, or else we have documented broad consent. But it's not clear what the EC thinks about that. Our reviewers, I don't think, are very happy about this. they tend to want a lot more from us. So we have attempted, if I skip down to the section, we've attempted to make a kind of dynamic consent, which has been broadly accepted so far in the review of this document by our researchers. The idea being that we have the informed consent forms. We basically implemented the kind of relationship that was mentioned in the presentation earlier, which allows a kind of a dialogical approach. And this is something that was first, in terms of the European Commission, it came out in the FP7 regulations, where it was held as an ideal. This would be an ideal form of consent. So we've tried to include it here with the idea that the researchers, where possible, will provide a kind of statement on how informed consent as a continuing dialogue has happened, or they'll provide a statement to say that it hasn't been possible or it hasn't been desirable. So as I say, this is in principle, it hasn't met any particular resistance yet. I think people can see that it's a good idea, but it remains to be seen just how that's going to work, especially in the context, as I just mentioned, of data that is federated and comes at us quite complicatedly. But overall, the idea then has been here that we are constrained in various directions such that we can't prescribe a single format for informed consent. And so we've tried to mine the regulations and the standards and the research to come up with minimal criteria that the researchers can then tailor to their own research activities. And then we can assess that and store those. So we have an informed, a uniform, we can excuse me. So we have a excuse me, my laptop's not the only thing dying, it seems. So we have a consistency of informed consent, but not a uniformity. I think that's my 10 minutes.
I think you don't sound very good there. Okay, well, thank you very much, Stephen. And I'd like to draw a link between Søren's talk and yours, coming back to this question of dynamic informed consent. So we're proposing that this is something that the HPP researchers should look at. But I was wondering, Søren, are you aware of places where this is actually happening? So is there a precedent? Are there other people who've done this?
Well, I think JNK's group in Oxford has implemented it in some. They're also developing a system that can do it, and it's been there's a current European cost action on, well, primarily on epigenetics, but which is trying to implement something like dynamic informed consent as a model. But I don't think it has been tried yet in any large-scale research projects.
Because it strikes me that if you try to do this on the scale that we're having in the HPP, it would be potentially enormously complex. You will have hundreds, if not thousands, of data subjects from various jurisdictions in various stages of their life. Some of them will die during the course of the study. And then, of course, there are various uses of the data. A piece of data will go into the system, will then be analyzed by different research groups for different purposes. So it's just striking that the complexity of the whole thing is enormous. And I'm just wondering whether that, anybody's tried to put this in practice.
Yeah, I would agree that the complexity is enormous, but on the other hand, the very same ITC developments which make something like the Human Brain Project possible also makes it possible to run a relational database of this complexity. Now, compared to many other things, of course, it's not really that complex. So it's possible. It would be possible to do, but I think you also have to think about things like some of the projects, individual sub-projects you run might be more sensitive or controversial than others, and may need sort of closer scrutiny of the informed consent and sort of stakeholder participation than other parts of it which are uncontroversial.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Maybe I have a question. Daniela speaking. I was listening to your, I mean, maybe it's a question we should discuss after my presentation, but I was looking at your proposal of dynamic consent, and I was thinking about the kind of data that we are collecting for the platform, and we are also collecting data that are available yet in our records. So we are doing a sort of retroactive study. And I was wondering how you're dealing with the fact that the platform is gathering a large amount of data we have in our hospitals and data that we have since years and years. How could you apply such a consent in a retroactive way?
That's definitely one of our major challenges. What we've one thing that the new data protection regulation will be good for is that it has a clause for research which is very clear. It's Article 89, and it basically allows for the use of data for research and statistical and historical contexts. And I feel like we're going to have to rely on that quite a lot, exactly because of this. These sorts of questions are probably not conceptually intractable, but they're very practically difficult. And it's not clear what value would come from trying, for instance, to find a data subject from 20 years ago. So we'll rely on the GDPR for that. In the meantime, the dynamic consent that I just talked about, we've left that quite open. The idea behind that is that a researcher can write a statement about why the type of consent they've gone for isn't dynamic, and that gives them the opportunity to write something that will explain the sort of issues they would face and why the sort of robust sort of consent hasn't been achieved, but that it hasn't led to ethical issues. So I'm hoping that the openness of that sort of statement on an ongoing dialogue can provide a way to account for this. But at the minute, it remains a bit of a grey area. It's difficult to know. I mean, on a very strong reading of the constraints we have, then no published data would be possible to be used because we don't have statements from the people involved in the studies. We don't even know often where the studies were carried out. But it's published data, so I mean, we have to sort of assume a research integrity about that. But it's definitely it's a real issue, especially from the ethics reviewers who sometimes ask very difficult questions of us that require quite a lot of thinking.